Good day to you, G1s. In this age, this generation of HD gaming via consoles and PC games that run great on rigs that pump out more power than a warp drive, it's easy to get lost in the gloss and bit crunching. Systems differ greatly in architecture this generation, and the console war is fueled today by its processors. But amidst all this bump mapping and super textures, how much does a console's raw power truly affect its success? I invite you to join me in a look at the battles that have been fought in the eternal war for gamers' paychecks. Seeing it through my own lifetime, I was born in 1983, the year of the games industry crash. Too many games flooding the market without enough demand to follow them. The primitive computing technology of the time also made many of the games too similar to each other. Pong here, Pong on the top there, Pong in the corners over there, Pong with dot paddles and paddle dot. You get what I mean. The crash was an eye-opener for game designers who thought they could just take a shit in a box, write a video game on it, and people would buy scores of it. Nintendo was just warming up, however. Undaunted, they released the Famicom in Japan with strict licensing rules to prevent another explosion of horrendous game releases. The NES, as it was known outside of Japan, sported much better graphics than the Atari-era consoles. Deeper games and a control of it, while it seems bare-bones basics by today's standards, was incredibly innovative at the time and has influenced every console controller to follow to this day. Looking to capitalize on the rebirth of the games industry, Sega manufactured a console to beat the NES at its own game, the Sega Master System. More powerful hardware allowed Master System games better graphics with much more color and less of those strange glitches that the NES suffered when too many sprites were on screen. However, Sega System never even got close to the popularity of the NES. Nintendo was synonymous with video game. How could anyone compete? Sega decided to take their newer arcade hardware and make a new home console, this time proudly boasting its 16-bit processing power. The Bit War, as it became known, was born. The Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, had graphics that blew away the NES. It still struggled, however, to wrestle the fans away from Nintendo. Aggressive advertising campaigns and a spiky blue hedgehog later, Sega finally started to build up some steam. It was expected, however, that in due time Nintendo released their own 16-bit beast, the Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo, or SNES, or SNES, or whatever you wanted to call it. It was the answer to the Genesis. Though the clock speed on the Genesis was actually a bit faster than the Super Nintendo, anyone could tell that the SNES had better graphics. Bigger sprites, more fluid animation sets, and Mode 7 games were all commonplace to SNES enthusiasts. Despite these huge advantages, however, the SNES and Genesis fought incredibly neck and neck. For one brief moment even, Sega slipped ahead of Nintendo. It didn't last, but it sure made things exciting. You may have noticed I didn't mention the TurboGrafx 16, and well, that's because I really don't know much about it. Besides, this is about the console war, and the TurboGrafx 16 was more of a console casualty. Well, we could note that midway through the 16-bit era, Atari Jaguar and Panasonic 3DO were released. The Jaguar boasted it was a 64-bit console, and with some funky math and leeway on their part, they were right. Didn't mean that the games looked any better than your average SNES game, though. There were some exceptions, but just not enough. The 3DO was a powerhouse with a CD format and decent 3D capabilities for its time, but an incredibly high price tag of $700 kept even avid game collectors away until after the system was discontinued. On the 16-bit era, Sega tried to one-up Nintendo without actually making a new system. A CD attachment for the Genesis promised new game experiences, but anyone able to afford one will more likely just get an SNES and a Genesis, as most Sega CD games weren't all that great anyway. Spare some excellent RPGs, I may point out. The 32X later tried to repeat what Sega attempted with a Sega CD, but with raw power, about a year before the release of the Saturn. Practically no one bought a 32X, and the game quality and graphical impressions didn't matter when there was nobody playing them. Then began the 32-bit era, a time that changed the face of gaming forever. Sega was predicted to be the leader of the industry this generation. The Saturn boasted the best 2D tech money could buy, and a higher maximum resolution than Sony's PlayStation. Who was Sony anyway? Silly newcomer to the games industry. They should just stick to TVs. Nintendo was lagging way behind with the release of the N64, but promised a gaming powerhouse upon release with amazing 3D graphics. But what was all this jazz about 3D anyway? The industry was built on 2D. Gamers loved 2D. Well, trying to one-up Sony, Sega pushed the Saturn out way too early, before game companies were even ready to finish the launch titles, and put 3 processors in the beast as opposed to the original plan of 1, which pushed its cost up considerably. Unfortunately, a head start with little to no games is no head start. Sony's PlayStation didn't take long to establish a fan base. 3D was becoming a standard of this generation of gaming as well, so Sega's 2D strengths didn't matter much at all. Multi-platform games were generally 3D, and most of them ran much smoother on the PlayStation. Very interesting when you consider that when calculating raw power, the Saturn actually beat out the PlayStation by quite a margin. However, the PlayStation could be programmed for in C-base, while the Saturn had to be programmed for in machine code. And despite having 3 processors, multi-core programming techniques were archaic at best. Combined with the insanely difficult programming language, it was nigh impossible to tap Saturn's full potential. Eventually, the Nintendo 64 was released. However, by this time, Sony had snatched up the majority of the market. Its CD format allowed its games to have liberal voice acting and FMV sequences, while the N64's cartridge format could not. It seems that anyone willing to wait for the Nintendo 64 was willing to wait through load times anyway. Nintendo's grasp on the market began to slip. Sega decided to do what they tend to always do, and chime in the 128-bit era. Striving to make a console with as little resemblance as possible to the Saturn, Sega gave the Dreamcast a white body with a red logo, the exact opposite of Saturn's black and blue. Sega hoped a year head start on Sony's PlayStation 2 would be enough. Unfortunately for them, they were wrong. The PS2's DVD functionality overshadowed the Dreamcast. Arguments persist to this day over the power of the two systems. Most say the PS2 was worlds more powerful than the Dreamcast, and that was why it beat it out so swiftly. However, I would like to point out that the Dreamcast had much better texture capabilities, and most Dreamcast games were designed with 60 frames per second in mind, whereas most PS2 games are designed for higher poly counts at lower frame rates. It can never be truly discerned, however, as the Dreamcast never lived to see designers attempt to squeeze every ounce of power out of it. After the PS2, the GameCube and Xbox were released. Similar in power to each other, one could merely note that the Xbox could pump out a few more polygons than the GameCube, while the GameCube was capable of twice as many simultaneous textures as the Xbox, 8 as opposed to 4, which gave it much better water effects. However, when games went multi-platform, that tended to not make any difference. Games were getting expensive to make, and while during the 16-bit era, it was easy to tell what system a game was being played on, developers spent too long getting a game to work right on one system to scrap it all and build for the next from scratch. Eventually, Nintendo also slipped further back to the lowest point in their entire time in the industry. Microsoft's Xbox built a nice fan base out of newcomers and displaced Sega fans. And who the hell was this Microsoft anyway, just showing up in the games industry like that? Why don't they just stick to making computer software? Eventually, multi-platform games meant PlayStation 2 and Xbox. At most, the Xbox versions had higher resolution textures as the big graphical difference. Now, on to today, with the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and the Wii. I never hear an end to the arguments over which of the two behemoths is more powerful, and I'd like to say this. Look at the games. Do you see any difference? Do you need a microscope to see it? Games have become far too expensive to make. Game companies want the most bang for their buck. Streamline game design. Get one game that runs fine on both systems. Why utilize the processing power of the cell if it's not cost-effective? Why reconfigure the memory to give the 360 version better textures if the game will sell the same with the same textures and models on both systems? And finally, why is the last console out of the gate with incredibly simplistic graphical capabilities from a company that was going downhill for the last 2 generations kicking so much industry ass? Maybe it's not the power. Maybe it's the innovations. The 3DO had 3D games that ran really choppy, and multi-platform Saturn and PlayStation 1 games ran better on the PlayStation. Maybe it's the gameplay, how it feels. Maybe it's just having a great game that matters, and the console is just fluff. So which is the most powerful? There are too many variables to even give that an accurate assessment. And the more you think about it, the more thinking about it feels like wasting time. So if you'll join me, I'm going to sit back with my wired 360 controller and my laptop's USB port, playing some Phantasy Star Online with the graphics set way down so it runs smoothly, because I love that game. So, take your controllers upon yourselves and know that whatever power your system has isn't important. Just that it has the power to deliver you the gaming experience you want is all that matters.